To the fifth and final session of the Texas A&M online orientation for new university supervisors. This session focuses on the Cooperating Teacher folder, its purpose, and its content. In order to follow along with the audio for this session, it will be especially important to have copies of the handouts that will be included in the Cooperating Teacher folder. There is a list under Session 5 on the Supervisor Training Materials page. Pause now if you need to assemble these handouts. As you see on the first slide, we begin with the handout entitled Contents of the Sample Cooperating Teacher folder. This page is for your use only. I do not include this page in the mentoring folders. Hand deliver the mentoring folder to each Cooperating Teacher's classroom or place it in the Cooperating Teacher school mailbox. I do this at least 1 week prior to the official first day for the clinical teacher. This will give Cooperating Teachers time to read through its content and make note of questions. It will also give them time to contact you to answer any questions they may have. All of the handouts listed on the contents page are a suggestion based on the materials that I actually provide my cooperating teachers each semester. You may certainly add to or delete from this list. On the next slide, you see the first item for the mentoring folder. It is a sample of a cover page. Looking at your handout of the cover page, see the note at the top of the sample cover page. There's a suggestion that you staple your version of this page to the outside of each mentoring folder. From my experience, it's more likely that this page will be read as soon as the folder is received, simply because it is on the outside of the folder. Remember, you are to hand deliver the folder to each Cooperating Teacher's classroom or school mailbox at least 1 week prior to the clinical teacher's arrival. To repeat, this page, as with every page that has been provided, is to be used as an example only. In other words, you are empowered to compose your own informational pages based off of these sample pages. Next is the actual first page inside the mentoring folder. It is your welcome memo. Compose a memo similar to this one, introducing yourself and/or explaining general information about the clinical teaching semester. Be sure to emphasize the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Note the third paragraph where it says that written feedback from the cooperating teacher is a vital part of the clinical teaching semester. 2 options are listed. First option is a journal or spiral that can be handwritten or typed. The second option is to use observation forms that are available online. You may add more options, of course. Stress that the cooperating teacher must observe and fill out the formal observation form at least once prior to the midpoint and at least once between the midpoint conference and the final conference. Next is the weekly plan of action for cooperating teachers. It is a week-by-week reference with a timeline of what will be happening and when during the 13-week semester of clinical teaching. Even though this is a handout created for cooperating teachers, it will be helpful for you as the novice university supervisor. It will help reinforce all the information that you've been hearing about in the previous 4 audio sessions. Use this as a guide for composing your own weekly plan of action so cooperating teachers will know what is happening and when it is happening. We are not reading through all of the information on this handout. We will simply skim through it because most of this information has already been mentioned in previous audio sessions. Looking at the weekly plan of action for cooperating teachers, note that there are suggestions on what the cooperating teacher can do prior to the arrival of his or her clinical teacher. Week 1 has a lot of detail, which is especially helpful for a new cooperating teacher. After reading this information, cooperating teachers will know exactly what to expect for the first week. On the next slide, the details continue with week 2. Note the options for written feedback. There are 4 numbered items under this bullet. Be specific with the options when you compose your handout for cooperating teachers. Note the reminder that severe problems are to be reported to the university supervisor immediately. Weeks 3 and 4 discuss the first round of observations. On the next slide, you see weeks 5 and 6. The second observation is discussed as well as other miscellaneous details. Week 7 focuses on the midpoint conference. Under weeks 8 through 10, there's information on second environment. The next slide is the final page of the sample weekly plan of action. Weeks 11 and 12 discuss the fourth and final observation. Week 13 may extend into week 14 in order to total those 65 days that we've talked about. This information focuses on the final conference. The last bullet emphasizes the important last step for the cooperating teacher. The next slide is the miscellaneous handout entitled General Reminders, Dates, and Policies. Find your copy of this handout. This handout serves as a summary of the basic information for our 13-week clinical teaching semester. It is a useful source of information for experienced as well as novice cooperating teachers. Reading through this handout will also help you as a new supervisor. It will reinforce once again the overwhelming amount of information that has been given to you in these 5 audio sessions. You will see that it is not only a great go-to page for cooperating teachers, but for new supervisors as well. Let's quickly read through the headings and focus on a few topics that were not discussed fully in the previous audio sessions. The title is General Reminders, Dates, Policies. First of all, give your contact information. The following topics are addressed, and I'm just going to list these. Read through these. Clinical Teaching Handbook, start date, orientation seminar, ending date for clinical teachers, lesson planning seminar, arrival departure time, attendance, absences. Let me stop on this one. On a daily basis, your clinical teacher will enter arrival and departure times on an attendance log. It is the clinical teacher's daily responsibility to ask you, that would be the cooperating teacher, to initial that day's data indicating that you agree with it. Full responsibility and the pacing schedule is listed, clinical teaching notebook, professional responsibilities, career fair, comp day. Since not all school districts allow a comp day to be awarded to cooperating teachers, check on your school district's policy about a comp day first, and then let the cooperating teachers know details about this accordingly. Substitution policy. Remind each cooperating teacher that the clinical teacher may be a paid sub for up to 3 days in his or her classroom only. Stress that the cooperating teacher, university supervisor, and clinical teacher must all agree that the clinical teacher is ready to be a substitute teacher. This may occur any day after the first week of the first full responsibility. For the last bullet, note that I have stressed the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. I have written that it serves to validate a positive experience, but also provides written documentation on problems should that be the case. I've suggested that the cooperating teacher give as much written feedback as he or she wishes, but it is suggested that the cooperating teacher critique at least one lesson a week or summarize in writing the strengths and weaknesses of his or her clinical teacher at least once a week. The next slide is a continuation of this handout. There's detailed information on the cooperating teacher's options for written feedback, and this includes again the spiral journal option, which allows the cooperating teacher to give written feedback pertaining to any part of the day, including instruction, one-on-one interactions with students, classroom management, transitions, etc. The second bullet discusses written documentation in a formal format. For this option, there are various forms available to the cooperating teacher at the link provided. The last bullet explains the requirement for cooperating teachers using the formal observation form. Be sure to remind the cooperating teacher that he or she is to evaluate the clinical teacher as compared to the clinical teacher's peers rather than to experienced classroom teachers. That is very important. Observations by the university supervisor is discussed. Also, there's information on the midpoint and final conferences, and these were explained in detail in previous audio sessions. The next slide shows the two suggested pacing schedules. One is elementary and the other is the middle school, high school pacing schedule. These two pacing schedules are in the handbook on pages 22 and 23. As I mentioned, these are in the handbook, but it is helpful to include the appropriate one in the mentoring folder in case the cooperating teacher's not yet had time to read through the entire handbook. Include both if you're not sure which one's more appropriate for the cooperating teacher. The next slide is the attendance log. The clinical teacher is responsible for filling out the arrival and departure times for each day. Also, it is the responsibility of the clinical teacher to acquire an initial each day from the cooperating teacher indicating that the cooperating teacher agrees with the data entered for that day. The log is included in the mentoring folder so the cooperating teacher will see what it looks like. Be crystal clear, though, in explaining that the cooperating teacher is not responsible for keeping the attendance log up to date. This is the clinical teacher's responsibility. Next is the handout entitled Lesson Plan Requirements. We've already gone over this in a previous session, so we'll not spend any time on it now. Included in the mentoring folder, though, because it will give cooperating teachers additional details on the lesson planning requirements that are included in the handbook. These details will help the cooperating teacher better understand what is expected of the clinical teacher. Next is the sample observation form that clinical teachers may use to critique their clinical teachers. The point is to include an observation form of your choice from the ones available at the link provided for cooperating teachers. Next is the formal observation form. It's in the handbook on page 16. Again, include a hard copy of the formal observation form in the mentoring folder, even though it is in the handbook. You will, of course, provide the link so that cooperating teachers have access to this form online so that more copies can be printed as they are needed. The last slide is the midpoint final evaluation form, which is in the handbook on page 17. Include a hard copy in the mentoring folder. It will be filled out by the cooperating teacher as well as you for the midpoint conference and again for the final conference. Once again, remember that these handouts are samples of what I give my cooperating teachers. It is fine to use mine as a guide. You will tweak each one so that it is a reflection of you and your personal style of mentoring. Remember, if questions crop up, and they will during the semester, go online and access the appropriate audio PowerPoint session that will address your questions. If you're still unable to find an answer to your question, please contact either me or the Office of Field Experiences. My contact information is available at the bottom of the overview handout from Session 1. I hope you have a rewarding semester as you supervise one or more of our clinical teachers. I'll end Session 5 with Gig 'em. This is Sandy Johnson, Class of 72.